Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. Before we get into today's topic, the future of radio studios, I wanted to give you the results of this week's Weekly Wire web poll because I thought it was pretty interesting. On Wednesday, we asked the 8,000 radio decision makers that get our newsletter, how long have you worked in radio? The number one answer was 30 plus years, 26.8%, followed by 20 to 30 years, 20.8%, 10 to 20 years, 18.2%, 5 or less, 17.7%, and 5 to 10 at just 16.5%. So overall, the majority have been in radio for quite some time, which leads well into what we're going to talk about today, the future of radio studios. Because we can't look into the future without first taking a gander into the past and discussing the history of radio studios. The early radio studios were pretty rough. This is Nebraska's first radio studio in the 1930s-ish, around there. If you're watching this, you can see that it's quite a fire hazard. There's not a lot of free counter space, quite a mess really, but props for suiting up. Though I do have clients, by the way, in Nebraska, but their studios look considerably better than this. Here's another example from the early days, WOR radio in 1922. Much cleaner, but he is broadcasting directly from the transmitter site. Sadly, something I've actually done a few times over my career. Once was weather-related and terrifying. Gotta love living in Tornado Alley. However, it didn't take long for radio to get innovative with our studio designs. Many studios in the 30s and 40s looked more like recording studios or live performance studios because they were literally using them for live performances with everything from the music, sound effects, and actors on these radio shows being broadcast live on the radio, which of course required larger and more elaborate studios. By the 50s, radio studios started to get a little more streamlined with the equipment getting a little smaller. Love the papers in the mouth, a move we've all pulled. Radio turns us all into good multitaskers. By the time I started in radio in the early 80s, we had upgraded consoles, but we were still using carts for our songs and commercials and editing recorded calls and commercials on reels, which is why I know how to splice tape, a skill that actually came in handy in high school when a Russian ballet came to town and needed someone to run sound that knew how to splice tape. Made a couple extra bucks on a side hustle. In the 90s, we added CD players and lost the cart machines, of course. By the 2000s, we were all using automation computers, which really cut back the amount of equipment needed in the studio. And nowadays, radio studios can have significantly less equipment, leading to much smaller consoles. But I would argue we haven't innovated nearly enough, and too many of today's radio studios look too much like those of the past. That's mainly because people have a tendency to just build what they know and base new studios off of other studios they've worked in that they liked. At my old gig at LKCM Media Group, I was responsible for overseeing construction of our street-level on-air studios for the Ranch and Hank FM in downtown Fort Worth, built on the highest foot-trafficked corner in DFW. I think 3-4 million people a year, something like that, something crazy. So we wanted good visibility into the studio and visually appealing studios. To make that happen, I got everything I could out of the studios by having them wire everything to an engineering room, had the studio furniture company build in trenches for the computer monitors to improve the sight lines, and we brought in a lot more light. Then we put those lights on timers because on-air talent prefer to work in caves, so you have to remove that option, unfortunately. But, you can't spend all this money on studios, and then people can't see in them because the lights are off at night. So all of that not only made the studios look better, it also improved performance on team shows, in-studio interviews, and this made the studios better for digital and video content, of course. All of this begs this question. What will radio studios look like in the future? We don't have to imagine these studios of the future because they're already here. Future radio studios will look like today's audio-video podcast studios. Why, you ask? Because this is what tomorrow's car dashes will look like. It's all screens. And to look good on those screens, we have to look a lot better, which starts with our studios. Going to this audio-video podcast studio look will make radio studios much more video friendly, no less audio friendly if they're done right, and this kind of setup encourages conversations. When you try to do this, you get lots of pushback, but it can absolutely work. Here's how. You hook up a stream deck to fire anything the on-air talent needs to fire. Works just like hotkeys. Put a big monitor on the wall across from the talent for their internet and automation computers. And if level control is absolutely necessary, you bring in either a tiny mixer or, preferably, you just use a wireless mouse to control that on the large monitors. A fallback option for groups with 4+ stations in one market is to have one or two of these new studios that all stations can share, and a few other smaller booths that look like tiny versions of traditional radio studios, but can also double as solo studios for remote audio-video interviews using things like Riverside. If you need help with all of this, our 24/7 engineering service at Radio Station Consultants can walk you through it, or we can handle it for you entirely. Find us at radiostationconsultant.com. If you have pictures of your studio you'd like to share, or a picture of your dream studio you'd like to share, email it to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com. As always, if you have some thoughts you'd like to share on this or any other hot radio topic, submit an article about it by emailing submissions@radioupdate.com. Thanks for listening, watching, and reading. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a Radio Update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.